Brutal scenes from 20 years ago have returned. Tank incursions, bulldozed streets, destroyed infrastructure, mass arrests, and forced displacement of tens of thousands of Palestinians. This is not Gaza. This is the West Bank, where the Israeli army has been carrying out intense military campaigns across refugee camps, cities, and towns, causing fear of death, detention, and the Gazification of occupied Palestine. This week, Israel's army deployed tanks into the West Bank for the first time since the Second Intifada, while its Defence Minister Israel Katz said troops would remain there for the coming year. More than 40,000 Palestinians from the refugee camps of Jenin, Tulkarm and Nur Shams have been indefinitely forced to flee their homes, while Katz vowed to, quote, prevent the return of residents violating international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu instructed his army to step up operations in the West Bank in response to a string of bus bombings in central Israel. These were initially blamed on Palestinian fighters, but shortly after, 2 Jewish Israelis and a Palestinian were arrested in connection. And although similar operations have been taking place at a slower pace and frequency over the past decades in the West Bank, this new escalation has raised alarms. The World Health Organization has expressed concern as attacks on healthcare in the West Bank are, quote, starkly rising. The UN's humanitarian agency said these are lethal, warlike tactics that, quote, appear to exceed law enforcement standards. UN Chief Antonio Guterres has also said Israeli settler violence against Palestinians has increased in tandem, while calls for Israeli annexation of the West Bank have also grown louder. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we read between the lines of Israel's actions in the West Bank and look at the consequences this will have for Palestine's future, for the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, and the hostage-prisoner swap that families on both sides are desperately hoping will stick. Israel's escalation in the West Bank is taking place at a crucial moment for the ceasefire in Gaza. The first stage of this ceasefire is set to expire, with no real steps taken towards phase 2. Both sides, Israel and Hamas, have accused each other of violating the agreement. Israel last week delayed the release of over 600 Palestinian detainees, returning them to Ofra prison after they had boarded the buses that would take them to their families or into exile. Israel blamed Hamas for what it called humiliating ceremonies during the hostage releases and on handing over the wrong body of killed hostage Shiri Bibas, which was later returned. Meanwhile, talks on what happens next in this ceasefire hung in the balance. The parties have since resolved the issues and agreed to one more exchange that took place early Thursday morning. But there have been mistakes, hiccups, and blame along the way. The situation remains shaky, and whether we'll see a phase 2 is yet to be determined. I asked Palestinian political analyst Khalil Sayegh whether there is a genuine interest by both sides for this ceasefire to succeed.
I think everyone is interested in phase 1 to continue. I think the Americans have a lot of interest in seeing this coming through. The American administration has promised the hostages' families that they will bring everyone home. On the Israeli side, there is an interest actually to extend phase 1. That's what Benjamin Netanyahu wants, right? He wants phase 1 because what is phase 1? Phase 1 is a temporary ceasefire in which you gain your hostages in return for some humanitarian aid to Gaza without even full withdrawal from Gaza. So it's a win for Netanyahu, and he's trying to push that farther. Hamas, on the other hand, is not interested in the continuation of phase 1. They're interested more in moving toward phase 2, where they wanted to talk about the day after in Gaza, about political reality, about complete withdrawal of Israeli forces, as well as what they call tabid al-sujun, meaning, to empty Israeli prisons completely. So that's what they're interested in. So when we ask the question, are all sides interested in the continuation of the ceasefire? We have to define, what do we mean by ceasefire?
Some have criticized the ceasefire agreement for being just a guarantee for the release of the hostages and for a temporary pause in hostilities. But there's a different reality going on in the West Bank. Israel has intensified its escalations there. It's displaced tens of thousands of people. So what does that mean for the ceasefire in Gaza, or are these two separate things?
I think they're two separate things, and I think that Israel has successfully, for the last 20 years, have set the rules of the game when it comes to separating Gaza from the West Bank, and I think Hamas was fully or unwillingly playing part of this, tried to be involved in the West Bank. Using Gaza was when they had the 2022 escalation in response to violation of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we've seen where that led. And I think we've seen that Hamas had to accept this reality of separating Gaza politically from the West Bank. So that Hamas spokesperson, the day after the ceasefire agreement was signed, said that while we are going to a ceasefire in Gaza, we will continue to fight from the West Bank as much as we can. And I think it's also true that the Israeli government is using the West Bank to send the messages to its radicals that this is not really a ceasefire, this is just a temporary pause on fighting because we are fighting on another front, which is the West Bank.
And they've also sent reinforcements into Gaza as well.
Yes, we have to understand Israeli forces are still in Gaza. There is what's called the buffer zones, and they still bomb people sometimes. But the irony is that no one knows these rules or the areas they're supposed to not go to because nor Hamas nor Israel has published the actual terms of the agreements until today.
What can you tell us about the significance of the West Bank, cities and refugee camps that are being targeted in Israel's operation? Can you paint us a picture about what it means for Israeli raids to be carried out in Ramallah, for example, versus Jenin or Tulkarm?
All these refugee camps, as well as cities, Ramallah and others, are all within Area A under the full control of the Palestinian Authority, including the security control. So even under that were signed between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, these were supposed to be the BA responsibility, and Israel shouldn't enter there. And if they are about to enter, they're supposed to inform the Palestinian Authority. However, this hasn't been the case, and the Israelis have thrown the agreement completely and violated it. So legally, strictly legally speaking, there is no difference between Jenin refugee camp and Ramallah, where President Abbas lives. But in reality, what has happened over the years is that refugee camps, especially in the north of the West Bank, have become more and more stronghold for armed resistance, especially for Islamic Jihad and Hamas. And the Palestinian Authority have lost its full grab or monopoly over weapons on these areas. And that's why I think it became more normalized that the Israeli forces will get to a refugee camp like Jenin or Tulkarm and have its raids. As opposed to Ramallah, that doesn't really have that much of armed resistance. Thus, it's usually surprising or shocking when the military is there because there is no resistance. Yet, despite all of that, Israel will get into Ramallah and would arrest people even from next to the president's house, many times even people who are just simply planning nonviolent resistance.
What can you tell me about the impact of the US's decision to stop training and financing the Palestinian security forces? What impact will that have on the scene in the West Bank?
On paper, yes, there was a decision as part of cutting aid for a lot of anti-terrorism program. But on reality, it's still there. Now, if this happens, I think the biggest loss would be in equipments because a lot of these equipments come by Americans or come due to the pressure from the Americans. For example, Jordan and Egypt donate a lot of these equipments, but the Americans are the party that pressure Israel to allow it. The second thing I think would be harmed is the coordination between the Israelis and the Palestinian forces. A lot of these major coordinations goes through an American mediator who's based in Jerusalem.
Does that mean that the militant groups theoretically could become more free if the Palestinian security forces were not as strong to stop them from carrying out activities?
For sure. Absolutely. I think that the danger is always that. But I think more than that, folks in Washington don't want to see Palestinian security members leaving and joining these militants with their own weapons and their own training. Because you have to look at these armed groups in the West Bank as, they're a bunch of teenagers basically with guns many times, or young men with guns. They don't have any training on how to use these weapons, etc. But if we have Palestinian forces that were trained by the Americans and others start, leaving and joining the armed resistance, I think that what could lead to unprecedented circumstances. And this is what we witnessed during the Second Intifada.
What can you tell us about your interpretation of Israel's operations in the West Bank? When asked about annexation of the West Bank, Donald Trump said that he did not yet have a response. Meanwhile, obviously, Israel is expanding its operations. Is what Israel is carrying out in the West Bank a true military offensive after which you envision they will withdraw? Or do you imagine that this is some sort of a plan for a prolonged annexation of the West Bank?
I think the assumption is wrong that Israel is about to annex or invade because they are already there and they've been there since 67. I don't think there would the Israeli military stay in Jenin refugee camp. And I don't think so, not because of annexation question, just because of the Israeli mentality that doesn't want to pay the security price and the services prices, meaning they want an occupation, but free occupation. So by staying in Jenin, you'll have to provide services, and that's not something that they want. However, in terms of like annexation, they're always interested in annexing Area C and other areas that don't have as much Palestinian residents. My view is that annexation already happened on the ground. However, it's not formalized, and I don't think Israel really need to formalize it, to be honest, because it would only bring pressure from international community that they don't need. However, I think what they call a security operation in the West Bank leads to something more dangerous. It's the threats of ethnic cleansing that really never escaped the mind of Israeli generals and the Israeli leaders. And it's also scary because part of the government, Israeli radical parties like Smotrich's, whose actual plan for a war in the West Bank that would lead to the mass expulsion of the Palestinians to Jordan.
Is there anyone that can actually stop all of this from happening?
The unfortunate reality that the only power capable of stopping that is the US. And at this point, there is no enough incentive in the US to do that just because they are pressuring Israel more on the Gaza front. Obviously, because they have enough pressure from the Arab countries to stop the war, because this is destabilizing to the region, but also because of hostages' families. When it comes to the West Bank, I think the unfortunate reality that in the mind of the new administration, they understand there is a de facto annexation in the West Bank. And in their mind, Israel has the sovereignty, although they don't really say it officially. And thus, they don't really get involved in that as much. I think Arab countries have to basically pressure the US administration to pressure Israel on this issue. As far as the Palestinian concerned, they can only slow this down by avoiding any perpetration with Israel.
So, what happens to Gaza if ethnic cleansing is successful in the West Bank, like we're seeing in Jenin camp? What is the future of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and for the Palestinians themselves?
I think ethnic cleansing will fail in Gaza because of the Egyptian position. It's very likely to see incremental, mass migration from Gaza, like in the hundreds of thousands. But as I've said before many times, birth rate is high, wouldn't be an issue in terms of demography. Israel talked about, we can have them leave through the sea or through airports in Israel, but they didn't find a destination. I think the more danger is in the West Bank. If something happens in the West Bank, we are not sure how much Jordan can hold strong against attempts to ethnic cleanse, especially that the border is much longer. And also, Jordan has a lot of Palestinians who are related to the people in the West Bank, and a lot of people who are in the West Bank hold Jordanian passports and most likely would want to, cross to Jordan. So that's, I think, the more concerning in terms of ethnic cleansing. In Gaza, I don't think it would succeed eventually, but I think the fear and concern that we have is that Gaza is completely devastated, no schools, no water, no electricity, that a lot of people would want to leave when they have the opportunity, despite that there wouldn't be war.
In Israel, the priority since the start of the war in Gaza has been to bring the hostages home, but this hinges on the ability of Israeli officials not only to negotiate the next stage of the ceasefire, but to also make strategic security decisions that prevent another October 7. Yet, time and time again, Israeli officials have maintained that they won't end the war until Hamas is eliminated entirely. I spoke to Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, to try to understand what Israel's next steps might be, especially as it steps up its campaign in the West Bank. Chuck, what is the mood like in Israel when it comes to the Gaza ceasefire, especially that it's always about to collapse, it seems? And is there internal pressure on the Israeli government to make sure that it doesn't fall apart now?
There is very mixed feeling in Israel. On the one hand, the polls show overwhelming public support for bringing the hostages back, even if that means ending the war now without Israel having achieved all of its goals in the war. And so the government is responding to that. At the same time, there is, on the hard right, there are demands and there is strong pressure on the prime minister from within the coalition not to end the war because Israel didn't achieve all its objectives. So there is this mixed sentiment, and Netanyahu I think has given totally untoward attention to the political considerations here, including his own personal ones. It's not just keeping the coalition together, which any prime minister would want to do, but he wants to keep the coalition together because he wants to remain prime minister at least as long as his trial is underway.
Last week, Mr. Netanyahu expressed outrage at the Hamas hostage release scenes, calling them humiliating and provoking the delay of 600 plus Palestinian prisoners, which is in breach of the ceasefire. But we're also hearing horror stories from prisoners, Palestinian prisoners themselves, who suffered from abuse and torture at the hands of Israeli prison service members. We're seeing the scars. Why is there, do you think, a double standard when it comes to the treatment of prisoners by a state and hostages by an armed group that is considered a terrorist organization by many states, including Israel?
I don't believe most of the reports from the Palestinian prisoners. I'm not saying that there's never been abuse, there has been. In wartime, all armies do ugly things. Part of the war of the image is to make claims that do not hold up to real scrutiny. Again, there may have been one or two or a few cases.
I mean, there are investigations by credible groups, and the testimonies line up from prisoners across the prison system. It seems that there was a shift after October 7 regarding the treatment of prisoners.
Well, I don't know who these credible groups are.
Beit Salem is one of them, UN rights groups.
I certainly don't take the UN groups as being credible. The UN is a totally, I'll just say, biased organization, and their reports carry very, very little weight as far as I'm concerned. But tell them some more. Yes, after October 7th, there's no doubt that people in Israel were absolutely furious. And I'm sure some soldiers took the law into their own hands. There are a few actually who are now under indictment for doing so towards Israelis, not Palestinian prisoners.
Let's go back to Gaza. There are questions on what will happen after the last Israeli hostage has been released and whether Israel is going to go back into Gaza and basically finish the job that it's set out to do. Hamas, meanwhile, told us at the National that it will not disarm. Given all this, how likely is it that Israel is going to restart its military campaign in Gaza? And is there a scenario where this simply doesn't happen?
Well, I think one of the big factors here is the position of the Trump administration, which seems on the one hand to be giving Israel a free hand to do what it wishes, and at the same time seems to truly be committed to the second phase of the deal and with ceasefire, because I think that their priorities in the region are otherwise. They want to see the grand deal, the trilateral deal between the Saudis, Israel, and the United States. And it's part of the strategic objectives of building a pro-Western, anti-Iranian alliance. Now, in Israel, there's what I was saying before. There's the conflicting emotions. On the one hand, the sense that, well, we defeated them militarily. We did most of what we could. We didn't succeed on the political level, and that's actually largely Israel's fault because we didn't propose an alternative governing body in Gaza. But there is still at least something to be done militarily. I, for one, am skeptical whether it's really worth doing. It will depend where we are at any given point in terms of how much they've actually been able to rebuild. If it's more significant, then we may have to go in and deal with it.
So what about the West Bank right now? Is it annexation? Is it just pressure on the Palestinian Authority? What's the big picture strategy here? Because all we're seeing is destruction, mass arrests, raids. And how does the U.S. decision to stop arming and training Palestinian security forces actually play into all of this? Does it have any weight or bearing?
First of all, what's happening in the West Bank at the moment, I believe, is, again, this dual reality, which is on the one hand, yes, there is an increased security threat, which must be addressed. And at the same time, it's related to Israeli domestic politics, because one of the ways that the prime minister has at least partly placated his right wing and kept Smotrich in the coalition is by clamping down harder in the West Bank. At this point, the real problem is the overall situation. Is the PA a legitimate and viable governing body in the West Bank? Is it a legitimate interlocutor for Israel? But the big issue, of course, is how we go forward and how we get out of this endless cycle of violence.
Regarding the West Bank, more than 40,000 people have been displaced from their homes. Israel Katz has said that he's not going to allow them to go back home. Is the humanitarian toll and the humanitarian side of Israel's operations not a consideration? Because There's security, and then there's also the cost of that.
There is no doubt that this is ugly. Just by the way, I wouldn't necessarily take the statements that they won't be allowed back. Well, I wouldn't necessarily take that seriously. But the real problem is why there is ongoing terrorism. And then, yes, Israel responds to it, and that's also a problem. But what's the source of the problem?
True, but Israel is the occupying force. Israel is the one with the military advantage and the responsibility to provide alternatives when people are being forcibly displaced. For example, in Jenin, there hasn't been schooling, there haven't been pharmacies, supermarkets, many of them are closed. People aren't able to access medication, just the daily necessary things that people need. There are human beings involved in all sides of this.
I think it's taken into account, maybe not sufficiently. And I certainly don't want to defend every Israeli action in the West Bank because I'm not sure that they all should be. And some could be handled better. Of course, people are people and they all deserve to live in a respectable way. But there is a price to be paid when that is your ideology. And when you launch on October 7th, unfortunately, tragically, civilians pay the price. But a lot of those civilians also support the ideology and October 7th.
What do you make of the Arab mobilization to come up with an alternative plan to Trump's regarding governance and security in Gaza?
First of all, we have to see that an agreed plan is put forward. And that's already one questionable assumption. And the second thing is on the hopeful assumption that they do, it has to be an effective deal. From what we know of the Egyptian proposal so far, I do not believe that it will meet anyone's serious demands. It's basically a repackaging of things that have been said in the past.
What's the issue with it?
Well, we'll see what the final plan really looks like, but it's basically reconstruction. The Gulf countries will contribute to reconstruction and will contribute to security.
Where are the issues with that from the Israeli perspective?
I mean, in theory, it's fine. Are the Arab countries really are they really going to send in significant forces to maintain security? Are they going to fight Hamas? Because this isn't a peacekeeping mission. This is a peace-fighting mission. So I don't see the long list of countries volunteering to do that. I mean, I hope my skepticism here is misplaced. I don't see that there's an effective plan coming. The Trump plan, of course, was dead on arrival. Okay? It's a non-starter for the Arab world, for the Palestinian side. It had no chance of happening. But I do think that there is a good thing, is that it forces the Arab world to start thinking seriously about Gaza again and realizing that the Arab world has to play a role here also. So I think these countries do have to be involved in the solution, or it may require a greater investment on their part. I don't necessarily mean financial.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. We will be covering every development on the situation in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel on thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor. And I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Thank you for listening.